Let me tell you about the most terrifying course in the entire galactic university system. Advanced Predator Psychology 101. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Sounds like something you'd take if you wanted to become a serial killer, right? Well, you're not entirely wrong. The course was taught by Professor Krellthax, and let me paint you a picture of this nightmare fuel. Imagine a praying mantis. Now imagine that praying mantis hit the gym for about 50 years, grew to 9 feet tall, and developed a serious attitude problem. His classroom looked like a serial killer's trophy room crossed with a natural history museum's reject pile. Skulls everywhere. Big skulls, small skulls, skulls with extra eye sockets, skulls with teeth that could open cans. The guy collected them from every hunt he'd ever been on, which, according to his bio, was basically his full-time hobby when he wasn't traumatizing students. His favorite party trick was pointing at random skulls and explaining in excruciating detail how he'd killed whatever used to live inside them. Now, most students enrolled in this class were already apex predators from their respective worlds. You had your standard-issue death lizards, your void-hunting bird people, your living shadow creatures that fed on fear itself. You know, the usual crowd. They'd walk into that classroom, see Krellthax's skull collection, and immediately understand they were dealing with someone who didn't mess around. Then there was Jake Murphy. Jake was the only human exchange student in the program, which should have been everyone's first red flag, but hey, hindsight's 20/20. He showed up to the first day of class about 15 minutes late, carrying what looked like a military surplus duffel bag and wearing the kind of expression that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else in the galaxy. Professor Krellthax was in the middle of his opening intimidation speech when Jake shuffled in. You know the drill. The whole "I have killed creatures that would give your nightmares" routine. Classic Predator teacher stuff. Ah, Krellthax clicked, his mandibles spreading in what I assume was supposed to be a threatening smile. The human finally joins us. How delightfully primitive. The other students chuckled. Well, the ones that could chuckle. The blob creature just made wet squelching sounds, which was probably the same thing. Jake dropped into an empty seat near the back, completely ignoring the skull of some horned beast that was literally staring at him from the desk. He unzipped his duffel bag just enough to peek inside, nodded to himself, then zipped it back up. As I was saying, Krellthax continued, gesturing with one of his razor-sharp appendages toward his prize display, this skull belonged to a Rigelian thunderbeast. Notice the reinforced cranium? Designed to withstand atmospheric pressure changes during their legendary death dives. I took this particular specimen during my 3rd molting cycle, using nothing but my natural weapons and cunning. The class oohed and awed appropriately. Even the crystalline student chimed with what sounded like impressed frequencies. Jake raised his hand. Yes, human, Krellthax asked, probably expecting some trembling question about bathroom breaks or maybe whether the course had a curve. Yeah, quick question, did you eat it or was this more of a sport hunting thing? The classroom went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop, if anyone in the room had pins, which they didn't because most of them had claws. Krellthax's compound eyes focused on Jake with the kind of intensity usually reserved for laser weapons. I beg your pardon? The Thunderbeast, Jake said, like he was asking about the weather. I mean, that's a pretty impressive trophy and all, but I'm just wondering if this was a practical hunt or more of a recreational activity. Because where I come from, if you're not planning to eat something, killing it just to stick its head on a wall is kind of frowned upon. You could practically hear the other students' minds breaking. Here was this small, soft, apparently weaponless creature, questioning the hunting ethics of a professor who'd been perfecting the art of killing things since before some of their planets had developed written language. Krellthax's mandibles clicked rapidly, which in his species was either a sign of deep thought or barely contained homicidal rage. Hard to tell the difference, honestly. The hunt, he said slowly, is about dominance, about proving superiority over lesser creatures. Sustenance is merely a bonus. Ah, Jake said, settling back in his chair. That's an interesting perspective. And that was it. No follow-up questions, no obvious fear, no recognition that he'd just casually challenged a 9-foot-tall murder machine in front of a classroom full of other murder machines. Jake just pulled out what looked like a tablet, started taking notes, and waited for the lecture to continue. Krellthax stared at him for a long moment, probably trying to figure out if the human was incredibly brave, incredibly stupid, or incredibly suicidal. Then he shook his head and continued with his syllabus. But I could tell something had shifted. The professor kept glancing at Jake throughout the rest of the class, and that duffel bag seemed to be drawing more attention than it probably deserved. Class ended with Krelthax assigning everyone to bring a representation of their species' greatest predatory achievement to the next session. Standard first week homework. Most students were already planning which weapons or trophies to bring. Jake just shouldered his mysterious bag and headed for the door. "Mr. Murphy," Krelthax called out, "I trust you'll find something appropriate to share with the class." Jake paused at the doorway and looked back. For just a moment, something flickered across his face. Something that made me think maybe, just maybe, Professor Krelthax had no idea what he was dealing with. "Oh, don't worry, Professor," Jake said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've got just the thing." And with that he was gone, leaving behind a classroom full of confused predators and one very thoughtful professor who was probably wondering why his usual intimidation tactics had bounced off the human like rubber bullets off a tank. The next class was going to be interesting. If you thought Professor Krelthax was intimidating before, you should have seen him the next week. The guy had apparently spent his entire weekend hunting because his classroom now looked like a bone museum had exploded. New skulls everywhere, each one bigger and more terrifying than his previous collection. The centerpiece was something that looked like it could have eaten a small shuttle for breakfast. Multiple rows of serrated teeth, eye sockets the size of dinner plates, and what appeared to be retractable spikes along the cranium. "Behold," Krelthax announced as students filed in, "the skull of a void stalker from the Andromeda Spiral, one of only 3 ever killed by a single hunter." The other students were appropriately impressed. Pip, the anxious blob creature from Kepler 442b, was actually vibrating with terror. Rex, an overconfident lizard warrior who usually strutted around like he owned the galaxy, had gone suspiciously quiet. Even Luna, the analytical crystal being who normally treated everything like a fascinating data point, was humming in frequencies that suggested deep respect mixed with healthy fear. Jake walked in, still carrying that same duffel bag, took one look at the new display, and said, "Nice, very symmetrical, good bone density too. What'd you use, plasma rifle?" Krelthax's mandibles twitched. "My natural weapons, human. As I explained last week, true predators do not rely on artificial enhancements." Right, Jake nodded, settling into his seat. "So, more of a up-close and personal kind of deal." "That's actually pretty impressive, considering the reach advantage something that size would have." Now here's the thing that was driving Krelthax absolutely insane. Jake wasn't being sarcastic or dismissive. He sounded genuinely interested, maybe even a little appreciative. But there was zero fear, zero intimidation, zero recognition that he was looking at the remains of something that could have used his entire species as dental floss. The professor launched into his lecture about predatory hierarchies and dominance displays, but I could tell his heart wasn't really in it. He kept glancing at Jake, waiting for some reaction, some sign that his latest trophy had made an impression. Jake just took notes. By the 3rd week, it had become obvious that Professor Krelthax had developed something of an obsession. Each class featured a new and increasingly ridiculous skull. We're talking creatures that existed only in the deepest parts of space. Things with names that required 3 different sets of vocal cords to pronounce properly. "This," Krelthax declared, presenting what looked like the head of a mechanical dragon, "belonged to a cyber wraith from the machine worlds of Proxima 7. Notice the reinforced neural interfaces and the titanium-enhanced mandibles." "Oh, wow," Pip squeaked, which was about as close to speech as the poor blob ever managed when terrified. Rex had started sitting closer to the exits. Luna's crystalline structure was cycling through colors that probably meant something like nope, nope, nope in crystal language. Jake examined the skull with the same casual interest he'd show a mildly interesting rock formation. "Cyberwraith, huh? So we're talking artificial intelligence merged with biological components? That's fascinating. How'd you handle the electronic warfare aspects during the hunt?" Krelthax's compound eyes literally started twitching. The electronic warfare was considerable." "I bet," Jake said. "Neural hacking, probably some kind of sensory overload protocols. Must have been like fighting a computer virus with teeth." The professor stared at him. The entire class stared at him. Here was this soft little mammal casually discussing the tactical challenges of hunting cybernetic nightmare creatures like he was talking about weekend fishing trips. "Mr. Murphy," Krelthax said slowly, "you seem remarkably informed about predatory combat scenarios." Jake shrugged. "You pick things up." That was it. No elaboration, no bragging. Just, you pick things up, like advanced knowledge of interstellar monster hunting, was something you learned from watching documentaries. By week 4, Krulthax was getting desperate. He'd brought in something that I'm pretty sure violated several galactic weapons treaties just by existing in the same room as students. The skull was roughly the size of a compact car, with what appeared to be built-in laser-focusing arrays where the eyes should have been. Behold the cranium of an Omega-class destroyer beast from the Horsehead Nebula. This creature was single-handedly responsible for sterilizing 14 inhabited worlds before I tracked it down. The class was dead silent. Even Rex had stopped pretending to be brave and was openly cowering behind his desk. Jake tilted his head, studying the monstrosity. 14 worlds, huh? That's quite a body count. What was its primary sterilization method? Orbital bombardment or more of a surface-based approach? Krulthax's mandibles were clicking so rapidly now, they sounded like an old-fashioned typewriter. Surface-based. It would consume entire ecosystems. Ah, a biological approach. Makes sense given the jaw structure. Jake made a note on his tablet. How long did the hunt take? 17 standard cycles. Wow. Persistent little guy, weren't you? And there it was again. That complete absence of fear, mixed with what sounded almost like approval. Not approval of the killing, necessarily, but approval of the persistence, the dedication, the sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Krulthax was starting to look less like a terrifying apex predator, and more like a frustrated teacher whose star pupil was failing to appreciate his carefully prepared lesson plan. After class, I overheard him talking to his teaching assistant, a nervous bird creature named Chirp, who mainly existed to clean up the classroom and occasionally provide someone smaller for Krulthax to intimidate when students weren't available. The human shows no fear, Krulthax was saying. None. It is unnatural. Perhaps his species simply lacks the proper survival instincts, Chirp suggested. No, that is not it. The professor was pacing now, his claws clicking against the floor. He understands what he is looking at. His questions are too informed, too specific, but he shows no recognition of threat, no submission response. Maybe he's just confident? Krulthax stopped pacing. Confident in what exactly? He is small, weak, clearly evolved from some manner of tree-dwelling creature. What could he possibly be confident about? That was when I noticed Jake had forgotten his duffel bag. It was sitting there by his desk, and for the first time since classes started, it was unzipped just enough to see inside. Now I couldn't make out much from where I was sitting, but I could see something white, something large, and something that definitely looked like bone. Krulthax noticed it too. He approached the bag slowly, like it might explode. Chirp fluttered nervously behind him. Should we look inside? Chirp whispered. Krulthax reached toward the bag, then stopped. His head tilted, compound eyes focusing on whatever was visible through that small gap. Professor? Chirp prompted. Krulthax straightened up abruptly and stepped back from the bag like it had just caught fire. We will wait for the human to return, he said. But his voice had changed. Gone was the casual confidence, the predatory swagger. He sounded uncertain. Jake showed up about 10 minutes later, looking mildly annoyed. Sorry, Professor, forgot my bag. He shouldered it without ceremony. See you next week. As Jake left, Krulthax called after him. Mr. Murphy, next week's assignment. I want you to bring your representation of your species' greatest predatory achievement. Jake paused at the door. You sure about that, Professor? Quite sure. Jake's smile was back, that same smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Your call. After he left, Krulthax stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where the duffel bag had been. Chirp, he said finally. Yes, Professor? Cancel my appointments for the weekend. I need to do some research on human evolutionary history. Any particular aspect, sir? Krulthax looked at his collection of skulls, his lifetime of trophies, his carefully curated display of dominance and terror. All of it, he said quietly. I need to understand what I am dealing with. The Skull Wars were about to reach their conclusion. Week 5 arrived, and the classroom was packed. Word had gotten around the university about the ongoing battle of wills between Professor Krulthax and the mysteriously unflappable human. Students from other departments had started showing up just to watch the show. Krulthax had outdone himself. His latest trophy was something that defied several laws of physics just by existing. The skull was easily 12 feet long, covered in what looked like natural armor plating, and had more teeth than seemed mathematically possible. "Students," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was absolutely certain he'd finally won, "I present the skull of an elder god-eater from the void between worlds. This creature existed before your civilizations developed language, before your suns began to burn. I am the first and only being to have successfully hunted one." The classroom was dead silent. Not the usual impressed silence, but the kind of silence you get when everyone stops breathing at the same time. Even the exchange students from other classes were staring in obvious terror. Rex had actually fainted, just straight up toppled over. Tip was making a noise like air slowly leaking out of a balloon. Luna's crystalline structure had gone completely transparent, which I'm pretty sure was her species' version of playing dead. Jake walked in right on schedule, duffel bag in hand, took one look at the massive skull dominating the front of the classroom, and whistled appreciatively. "Okay, that's actually really impressive," he said. "Pre-stellar formation era, we're talking serious deep time here. How'd you even find something that old?" Krelthak's mandibles spread in what was definitely a victory smile. Finally he'd gotten a reaction that suggested appropriate awe. "Ancient hunting grounds," he said smugly. "Locations known only to the most experienced of predators. The hunt itself took nearly 2 centuries. 2 centuries, Jake nodded thoughtfully. "That's dedication right there. Persistence hunting on a geological timescale." He set his duffel bag down on his desk. "Well, Professor, I have to admit, that's going to be hard to top." The professor practically preened. "Indeed, Mr. Murphy. Perhaps now you understand the difference between true apex predators and lesser species." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Jake said, unzipping his bag, "which is why I brought something I thought might provide some context. Now I want you to imagine the biggest thing you've ever seen. Maybe a building, maybe a mountain, maybe that time you looked up at the night sky and really grasped just how big space is. Got that image in your head? Whatever you're imagining, it's not big enough." Jake reached into his duffel bag and started pulling out what was very clearly a skull. But not just any skull. This thing kept coming and coming and coming. It was like he was performing some kind of impossible magic trick, because there was absolutely no way something that large should have fit in that bag. The jawbone alone was longer than Krelthak's was tall. The teeth were the size of traffic cones. The eye sockets could have been used as swimming pools for small children. Jake kept pulling, grunting slightly with the effort, until finally the entire massive skull was sitting on his desk, dwarfing everything else in the room, including Professor Kreltax's prized god-eater cranium. The silence in the classroom wasn't just dead now. It was buried 6 feet under, and had flowers planted on top. "Tyrannosaurus rex," Jake said conversationally, dusting off his hands. "About 65 million years old, give or take. Found this guy in what we call the Hell Creek Formation back on Earth." Krelthax was staring at the skull like it had just insulted his mother. His compound eyes were doing this rapid focusing thing that suggested his brain was having trouble processing what it was seeing. 65 million, he managed. "Oh yeah, this particular specimen lived during what we call the Cretaceous period, right before the big extinction event." Jake patted the skull affectionately. "Probably about 40 feet long when he was alive, weighed somewhere around 15,000 pounds. Bite force of about 12,800 pounds per square inch." Pip made a sound like a deflating whoopee cushion. "Now, the interesting thing about old Rex here," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that every creature in the room was having some kind of existential crisis, "is that he wasn't even the biggest predator from that era. We had something called Giganotosaurus that was even larger, and before you ask, yes, we have skulls of those too." Luna's crystalline structure was now flickering between colors so rapidly it looked like a disco ball having a seizure. "But here's the really fun part," Jake said, warming to his subject. "This guy? He lived on the same planet as my ancestors. Same planet, same time period, relatively speaking. And do you want to know the really amazing thing?" Krelthax opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. "We are still there," Jake said simply. "Rex here, he's extinct, has been for millions of years. But humans, we're not just still around. We've spread to over 300 worlds and counting." The professor finally found his voice. But that's impossible. Your species is clearly evolved for tree dwelling. You're small, weak, you have no natural weapons, no armor, No natural weapons," Jake interrupted, pulling out his tablet and swiping to what looked like a photo album. "That's an interesting point, actually." He turned the screen toward the class. The image showed what appeared to be a pack of wolves running across a snowy landscape. "These are wolves," Jake explained. "Apex predators from Earth. Powerful jaws, incredible pack-hunting instincts, perfectly adapted for killing large prey." He swiped to the next image, and this is what we turned him into. The new picture showed a tiny, fluffy dog wearing what appeared to be a rhinestone collar and a bow. Meet Duchess Fluffington III. She's a Chihuahua, barely weighs 4 pounds soaking wet, can't survive outside without a sweater, and her main predatory achievement is occasionally catching a tennis ball. Rex chose that moment to regain consciousness, took one look at the T-Rex skull, and immediately fainted again. "We took wolves," Jake continued, "literal apex predators, and we turned them into fashion accessories. Not through violence, not through domination displays, but through selective breeding and domestication. We made them want to be cute for us." Krelthax was making a sound like a broken air conditioning unit. "And that's just the beginning," Jake said cheerfully. "We domesticated aurochs, which were basically living bulldozers with anger management issues, and turned them into cows. We convinced cats to live with us, even though they could survive perfectly well on their own. We domesticated horses, elephants, and basically everything else we thought might be useful." He gestured toward the T-Rex skull. "But the really impressive part isn't what we domesticated, it's what we survived. Because while our ancestors were busy turning death machines into pets, they were also sharing the planet with things like this. 65 million years ago, Earth wasn't just inhabited by one species of giant predator. We're talking dozens, hundreds. The entire planet was basically one big death world, where everything was trying to eat everything else." Professor Krelthax sat down heavily in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. "And humans survived," he said quietly. "Oh, we didn't just survive," Jake said, his smile getting a little wider. "We thrived. We spread across the entire planet, developed agriculture, built cities, invented space travel, and eventually made it out here to hang out with you guys." He looked around the classroom, taking in the shell-shocked faces of his classmates. "The thing is, Professor, we didn't survive because we were the biggest, or the strongest, or the most naturally armed. We survived because we were the most persistent, the most adaptable, and arguably the most creative when it came to solving the problem of not getting eaten by things like Rex here." Krelthax was staring at the T-Rex skull with something that looked suspiciously like respect. 65 million years, he murmured. "Give or take," Jake confirmed. "And honestly, this is just one example. Earth's fossil record is basically a catalog of everything that tried to kill us and failed." He started packing up the skull, somehow managing to fit the massive thing back into his impossibly small duffel bag. Another magic trick that nobody questioned at this point. "So," Jake said, shouldering his bag and heading for the door. "Same time next week?" The entire classroom watched him leave in stunned silence. After about 5 minutes, Krelthax finally spoke. "Chirp," he said weakly. "Yes, Professor?" The bird creature's voice was barely a whisper. "Cancel the rest of my research appointments." "Sir?" Krelthax looked at his collection of skulls, his lifetime of hunting trophies, his carefully curated display of predatory dominance. Then he looked at the empty space, where a 65-million-year-old death machine had casually sat on a student's desk. "I think," he said slowly, "I need to redesign this entire course." The next week, something unprecedented happened in the history of Galactic University's Advanced Predator Psychology program. Professor Krelthax didn't bring a new skull. In fact, he'd quietly moved most of his collection to storage over the weekend, leaving only a few of his more modest trophies on display. The classroom felt almost empty without the usual forest of death staring down at everyone. "Today," Krelthax announced as students filed in, "we will be taking a different approach to our studies. Mr. Murphy, would you mind sharing more about your species' evolutionary history?" Jake looked genuinely surprised. "You sure? I mean, I'm not exactly a professor or anything." "I am quite sure," Krelthax said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd spent the entire weekend having a very long, very uncomfortable conversation with himself about the nature of predation. "All right then," Jake said, pulling out his tablet. "Where should I start?" "The beginning would be sufficient." Jake thought for a moment. "Okay, so picture this. About 2.5 million years ago, my ancestors were basically upright apes running around the African savanna. No claws, no fangs, no armor, no natural weapons whatsoever. They were surrounded by things like saber-toothed cats, cave bears, dire wolves, and giant hyenas that could crack bones with their jaws." Pip made a nervous squelching sound. Now, most species in that situation would either evolve better physical defenses or go extinct. Humans did something different. We invented tools. Rex raised a claw tentatively. He'd been much more subdued since the fainting incidents. Tools? Sharp rocks tied to sticks, basically. But it gets better. We figured out fire, which meant we could cook food, extend our activity into the night, and scare off most predators. Then, we developed persistence hunting. What is persistence hunting? Luna chimed, her crystalline structure pulsing with curious colors. Jake grinned. We would literally chase prey until it died of exhaustion. See, humans are endurance runners. We can't run fast, but we can run forever. We'd pick a target, usually something much faster and stronger than us, and just follow it. For hours, sometimes days. Krelthax leaned forward. That seems inefficient. Oh, it was incredibly efficient, Jake said. The prey would sprint away, we'd follow at a steady jog. They'd sprint again, we'd keep jogging. Eventually they'd collapse from heat exhaustion and dehydration, and we'd walk up and finish the job with our sharp sticks. The classroom was dead silent. We turned being slow into a weapon, Jake continued, and that was just the beginning. About 10,000 years ago we figured out agriculture. Instead of following herds around, we made the food come to us. How? Krelthax asked, though he sounded like he wasn't sure he wanted to know. We imprisoned plants, Jake said cheerfully. Took wild grasses and selectively bred them until they couldn't survive without us. Same thing we did with animals. We basically created Stockholm Syndrome on an ecological level. Pip was vibrating again. Then we invented civilization, which meant we could specialize. Some humans became really good at making tools, others got good at fighting. Others figured out how to make the imprisoned plants grow better. We developed writing so we could share information across generations. Jake swiped through images on his tablet. Medicine, engineering, mathematics, astronomy. We went from chasing antelopes with sharp sticks to building structures that could be seen from space in about 8,000 years. 8,000 years, Krelthax repeated faintly. Give or take. Then we invented warfare. Rex perked up at this. Warfare is familiar. Combat between rival predators for territory and resources. Yeah, except we weaponized everything, Jake said. We didn't just fight with claws and teeth, we made swords, spears, bows, catapults, cannons, guns, bombs, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and eventually nuclear weapons that could sterilize entire continents. Luna's structure went completely clear again. But here's the really weird part. We didn't just fight each other. We fought the planet itself. The planet? Krelthax asked. Ice ages, Jake said simply. For about 2 million years, Earth kept trying to freeze us to death. Glaciers would advance, covering most of the habitable land, and humans would just adapt. We learned to hunt woolly mammoths, built better shelters, developed fur clothing, invented new tools for surviving in sub-zero temperatures. He pulled up another image. Woolly mammoths, by the way, were basically living mountains with tusks, 15 feet tall, 12,000 pounds, and very bad tempers. We hunted them to extinction, using pointed sticks and teamwork. You killed creatures 15 feet tall with pointed sticks, Krelthax said slowly. Well, we had strategy, Jake said. Pit traps, coordinated attacks, fire drives. We basically turned every hunt into a military operation. But yeah, pointed sticks were our main weapon for about 90% of human history. Rex looked like he was having another existential crisis. Oh, and plagues, Jake added. Can't forget those. Every few centuries some disease would show up and try to wipe us out. Bubonic plague, smallpox, influenza, cholera, each one killed millions of people. And yet you survived, Krelthax observed. Not only did we survive, we eventually conquered the diseases. We figured out medicine, developed vaccines, built hospitals, established quarantine protocols. We turned our own immune systems into weapons against microscopic invaders. Jake was getting excited now, the way people do when they're talking about something they find genuinely fascinating. Then there were the natural disasters. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. Earth kept trying to kill us with geological events, and we just kept rebuilding bigger and better. We developed early warning systems, earthquake-resistant architecture, storm shelters. You fought your own planet, Pip squeaked. And won, Jake said proudly. Sort of. We're still working on some of the details. But we've basically turned Earth from a death world into a garden world through sheer stubborn persistence. Krelthax was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Murphy, how long did all of this take? From tool-using apes to spaceflight? About 2.5 million years. But most of the really impressive stuff happened in the last 10,000. 10,000 years. Krelthax murmured. My species has been using the same hunting techniques for over 1,000,000 years. Yeah, but you guys had natural weapons, Jake pointed out. You were already perfectly adapted predators. We had to build everything from scratch. Luna chimed softly. Your species transformed itself from prey to predator through technology and cooperation. Pretty much, and once we figured out space travel, we started spreading to other worlds. Some of those worlds had their own predators, their own death machines, their own impossible survival challenges. And? Rex asked, though he sounded like he wasn't sure he wanted to know. We colonized them anyway, Jake said with a shrug. Desert worlds, ice worlds, jungle worlds, ocean worlds. Worlds with gravity 3 times Earth normal. Worlds with atmospheric pressure that would crush most species. If it was even remotely habitable, we'd figure out how to live there. Your species, Krelthax said slowly, treats impossible survival challenges as recreational activities. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of crazy, Jake laughed. But yeah, basically. We have people who climb mountains for fun, dive to the deepest parts of the ocean for fun, jump out of perfectly good aircraft for fun. We've turned survival itself into entertainment. The professor stared at him. The entire class stared at him. Mr. Murphy, Krelhawk said finally, I believe I owe you an apology. For what? I have been attempting to intimidate a member of a species that survived ice ages, plagues, natural disasters, and sharing a planet with creatures like your Tyrannosaurus Rex, using nothing but persistence, creativity, and pointed sticks. Jake considered this. When you put it like that, it does sound pretty ridiculous. Indeed. Krelthax looked around at his remaining skulls, his modest collection of hunting trophies. I think perhaps I have been approaching the concept of predation from a rather limited perspective. Hey, those are still impressive kills, Jake said generously. I mean, I couldn't take down a void stalker with my bare hands. You guys are natural-born apex predators. That's actually really cool. But you turned wolves into chihuahuas, Rex pointed out weakly. Different skill sets, Jake said with a grin. You guys are built for individual excellence. We're built for collective problem-solving. Both approaches work, just for different challenges. Professor Krelthax stood up slowly, his impressive height seeming somehow less intimidating than it had at the beginning of the semester. Class dismissed, he said quietly. I have some thinking to do. As students filed out, I heard him talking to himself. 2.5 million years, he was saying. From prey animals to galactic colonization in 2.5 million years. Jake paused at the door. Professor? For what it's worth, your hunting stories are genuinely impressive. You're just dealing with a species that's had to get really, really good at not dying. After Jake left, Krelthax sat alone in his classroom, surrounded by his collection of skulls, probably wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd been measuring predatory success by entirely the wrong criteria. The final exam was going to be very interesting. 2 weeks later, the classroom had been completely transformed. Gone were most of Professor Krelthax's intimidating skull displays, replaced by what looked suspiciously like a more collaborative learning environment. The professor himself seemed different too, less predatorily imposing, and more genuinely curious. Today marks our final examination, Krelthax announced to the packed classroom. Word had spread throughout the university about the human who'd been casually redefining predator psychology, and students from every department had crammed in to watch. Each of you will present your species' greatest predatory achievement. Not your personal accomplishments, but your species as a whole. What evolutionary adaptation, hunting strategy, or survival mechanism best demonstrates your people's predatory nature? Rex went first, still somewhat subdued since his repeated fainting episodes. He presented the Draknari war clan's ability to coordinate pack hunts across multiple star systems, tracking prey for decades through hyperspace. Impressive stuff, genuinely terrifying logistics. Pip somehow managed to overcome her anxiety enough to explain how her species could dissolve their cellular structure to flow through microscopic gaps, then reconstitute themselves inside their prey's body cavity. The entire classroom collectively decided never to get too close to Pip again. Luna chimed through a presentation about crystal-based hive minds that could predict prey movements through quantum probability calculations. Mathematics as a hunting tool, very elegant, very unsettling. Other students showcased natural cloaking devices, acidic blood that could melt through starship hulls, parasitic reproduction cycles that made horror movies look like children's cartoons, the usual galaxy of nightmare fuel that made up advanced predator psychology. Then it was Jake's turn. He walked to the front of the classroom with what appeared to be a simple tablet and that same easygoing demeanor that had been driving everyone insane for weeks. "So," he said, "my species' greatest predatory achievement." He paused, looking around the room. This is actually kind of a tough question, because humans approach predation differently than most species. "How so?" Professor Kreltax asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Well, most predators evolve to hunt specific prey, right? You get really good at killing particular things in particular ways. Humans did something weirder. We became generalist predators." Jake swiped his tablet, bringing up what looked like a star map. "This is human space as of last year. 347 colonized worlds, ranging from desert planets to ice worlds to ocean worlds to gas giant atmospheric stations. Each one presented unique survival challenges, unique ecosystems, unique apex predators." He zoomed in on a particular system. "Take Kepler 438b, for example. When we first arrived, the dominant predator was something called a razor vine. Imagine a carnivorous plant that could grow to about 60 feet in length, with thorns that injected paralytic toxins and the ability to move faster than most animals could run." Pip made her usual nervous squelching sound. "The colony ship had about 10,000 people and enough supplies for maybe 6 months while they established infrastructure. Within 2 years, razor vines were extinct on that planet." The classroom went very quiet. "How?" Rex asked. "Herbicide," Jake said simply. "Turns out carnivorous plants are still plants. We analyzed their cellular structure, developed a targeted chemical that disrupted their photosynthesis, and sprayed it from aircraft. Took about 3 months to clear the entire continent." Professor Krelthax blinked slowly. "You committed ecological genocide with chemistry." "We removed an existential threat to human colonization using applied science," Jake corrected. "Same result, different perspective." He swiped to another image. "Or take Proxima Centauri C. The apex predator there was something called a phase hunter. Could shift between dimensions, basically invisible and intangible until it decided to attack. Killed about 200 colonists in the first month." "And?" Luna chimed nervously. "We invented dimensional anchors," Jake said. "Force field generators that locked local spacetime into a single dimensional phase. Couldn't phase shift if the physics wouldn't let them. Problem solved." Krelthax was making that broken air conditioning sound again. "You altered local reality to counter a predator adaptation." "We used engineering to solve a survival problem," Jake said. "That's kind of our thing." He brought up a new image, this one showing what looked like a massive space station. "But I think our real achievement isn't how we deal with individual predators. It's how we became an apex predator species on a galactic scale." "Meaning?" Krelthax asked, though he sounded like he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. "Well, think about it. Most species become apex predators on their home world, then maybe expand to a few similar worlds. Humans became apex predators on planets where we're not even supposed to be able to survive." Jake gestured toward his audience. "Everyone in this room represents a species that evolved perfect adaptations for their particular environment. You're all naturally suited to be predators in your specific ecological niche." He paused for effect. "Humans don't have a niche. We make our own." The silence in the classroom was getting oppressive. "We're persistence hunters who figured out how to make our prey come to us. We're tool users who turned our tools into extensions of our will. We're social creatures who turned cooperation into a weapon more powerful than any individual strength." Jake swiped through more images. Ships, stations, cities, worlds transformed by human engineering. "But the really impressive thing isn't what we've accomplished, it's how we think about accomplishment itself." "I do not follow," Kreltax said. "Most predator species see survival as the goal. Stay alive, reproduce, maybe expand territory if you're successful. Humans see survival as the starting point." Jake pulled up what looked like a timeline. "Once we figured out basic survival, we decided we wanted to understand how the universe works, so we invented science. Once we understood science, we decided we wanted to explore other worlds, so we invented space travel. Once we reached other worlds, we decided we wanted to stay, so we invented terraforming." Rex was staring at him. "You terraform worlds?" "About 40% of our colonies are on planets that weren't habitable when we arrived," Jake said casually. "We change the atmospheric composition, adjust the gravity, introduce Earth species, modify the local ecosystem. Basically, we take death worlds and turn them into garden worlds." "You reshape entire planets to suit your needs," Professor Kralthak said faintly. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of arrogant, Jake laughed. But yeah, essentially. If we can't adapt to the environment, we adapt the environment to us. Luna's crystalline structure was cycling through colors so rapidly it was making people dizzy. And that's not even the weird part, Jake continued. The weird part is that we do all of this as a side effect of being curious. Curious, Pip squeaked. Humans explore, colonize, and terraform worlds because we want to see what's out there. We invent new technologies because we want to know how things work. We solve impossible survival challenges because we're bored and it seems like it might be interesting. Jake looked around the room. Most species become apex predators to dominate their environment. Humans became apex predators almost by accident, because we kept getting distracted by interesting problems. Humph. The professor was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Murphy, he said finally, are you suggesting that your species achieved galactic predator status as a hobby? Jake considered this seriously. I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds ridiculous, but yeah, kind of. We didn't set out to become the dominant species in local space. We just wanted to see what was out there. And it turned out that surviving in hostile environments and reshaping entire worlds was the price of admission. He shrugged. So we paid it. Professor Krelthax looked around his classroom, taking in the shocked faces of his students, the visiting faculty who'd come to watch the presentation, the growing crowd of beings who represented dozens of species and hundreds of worlds. Class dismissed, he said quietly. As students filed out in stunned silence, I heard him talking to himself again. Galactic apex predators, he was muttering, as a hobby, because they were curious. Jake paused at the door. Professor, thanks for a great semester. I learned a lot about predator psychology. Mr. Murphy, Krelthax called after him. What course are you taking next semester? Jake grinned that same grin that had been haunting the professor's dreams for weeks. Advanced herbivore psychology, he said. Should be interesting to see how the other half lives. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind a classroom full of apex predators who were all having the same uncomfortable realization. If humans could casually dominate predator species while barely paying attention, what exactly were they going to do to the herbivores? 3 days later, Professor Kreltax sat in his office staring at the final grades for Advanced Predator Psychology 101. Jake Murphy had scored a perfect mark, naturally. Not because he'd demonstrated superior hunting prowess or intimidation tactics, but because he'd fundamentally redefined what it meant to be a predator. There was a knock at his door. Come in, he called, expecting his teaching assistant. Instead, Jake walked in, looking slightly embarrassed. Hey, Professor, I wanted to apologize. Krelthax blinked. Apologize? For what? I think I might have accidentally ruined your class, Jake said. I heard some of the other students are having existential crises about their predatory identity. Rex enrolled in therapy. Pip's been in the library researching human history for 3 days straight. Luna asked if she could audit some human courses next semester. The professor considered this. Mr. Murphy, in 40 years of teaching, you are the first student who has ever taught me something genuinely new about the nature of predation. Is that good or bad? It is educational. Krelthax leaned back in his chair. Tell me, what did you study before enrolling here? Jake looked sheepish. Actually, I'm a history major. Medieval European agricultural practices specifically. This was just an elective to fill out my schedule. There was a long pause. You are telling me, Kreltax said slowly, that you revolutionized advanced predator psychology as an elective, while majoring in medieval farming. Yeah, it sounds pretty ridiculous when you put it like that.